Hello, Jeremy Hadler viewers. My name is Zach, owner, founder, all the above of BSC Cards. You can find us at BSC Cards on Instagram. What we're all about is a sports card hobby page showing off my personal collection of Cleveland Browns and other favorite players like GOAT Series legend Ray Guy. And on top of that, do some story sales pretty often to help get other collectors out there rare, unique pieces for their own enjoyment. I really have been in this hobby almost a decade now, put in that extra time to help find cool, rare pieces for all 32 NFL team fans to be able to enjoy. You can also follow us to get updated on when we'll be at a show or an event in the Eastern Pennsylvania or New Jersey area, and hope to see y'all there. Enjoy the video coming up, and peace.
Hello, folks. Welcome to Jeremy Hadler's YouTube channel. I'm host Jeremy Hadler, and today we are discussing here Season 3 of the GOAT Series. Season 3 is back here, and we're on Episode 4. We're doing the 1990s with our special guest, Jeff. Woo!
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So we get to have Jeff come on now is talking the league instead of just talking the Packers, which we all love talking the Packers about. But we will dive through here once again we're going to go through the 1990s version here, Episode 4 of Season 3 of the GOAT Series. You know how we always do here, folks, with mentioning of how we look at these players and how we pick our players is looking through the achievements, how they play on the field, how they play off the field, what were their accolades, how many stats did they get of like playing with a team or with the general of the 90s is what we're looking for. So what were their stats in the 90s specifically is what we look for. And we're not doing honorable mention because there's no worthy honorable mention because we're going per position. So how we're doing it in our position-wise with me and Jeff is one quarterback, one running back, two wide receivers, one tight end. All line, we're going to have to do LT, left guard, center, right guard, right tackle, one defensive tackle, one outside linebacker, one defensive end, strong safety, free safety, middle linebacker, two CBs, kicker, punter, and return, of course. So we will start off with quarterback to start with the offense, move our way to defense, and then save best for last. Special teams is what a lot of people like to do. But we'll start with our guest. Jeff, who do you have as your quarterback?
I'm sure this is going to be a huge shock to everybody, but although the technical answer may be Elway, could be argued for sure. I can't not pick Brett Favre. Just his impact, separate of his achievements of 3 consecutive MVPs, which is insane in its own right. I know he only has the 1 Super Bowl when compared to Elway's 2, but I just think the impact he had on the Packers as a whole, like kind of helping them revive a bit and get through a pretty difficult era and be able to become the team that everybody knows today. It's obvious that he played a very pivotal role in that, and they probably wouldn't be the organization they are today without that time period. It's kind of like the catalyst for their success today in a lot of ways. More Homer-based reasons, I guess I'll say Favre, but I think there's some objectivity there too.
Nice. I'm also going with Brett Favre. I thought he deserved it too because the thing that I think of, Jeff, was we were mentioning of his impact, the gunslinger. He started the definition of gunslinger to me, and you think of like this today with like Patrick Mahomes a little bit. You think of some of the guys, Aaron Rodgers a little bit because he learned a bit from Brett Favre when they were, of course, in the transition period with working together. What Brett really stands out to me is you think of what he did back in the day. You couldn't do those throws. There was insane throws, whether it was an interception or those ridiculous throws like a touchdown to Sterling Sharp and like the complete opposite of the field I always think of. He had one of the best arms in the NFL, period. Now, of course, you can definitely argue with John Elway, but I think of pure talent-wise, I think I go Favre. I go Favre over Elway. Favre just stands out to me the most. So I think I'm gonna have Favre here. Stands out to me the most here. The gunslinger. I mean, you're seeing with Josh Allen today, who won MVP as well this past season. So got to give it to Brett Favre here.
Yeah, completely agree. Also, just one more quick point is 3 straight MVPs is just a crazy. I feel like that couldn't even happen today. I feel like just given people's patience with things, I feel like people would get bored. Like in almost like any major league, if a player was to win 3 consecutive MVPs for Patrick Mahomes, for instance, I feel like people would actively get bored of that and like would want somebody else to win it, right? So even that alone is probably something that may never happen again, but we'll see.
All right, let's move on to running back here. I think this is a more definitive position because this is very well known in the 90s. There were so many great running backs. Jeff, who do you have as your running back?
Got to go with Barry Sanders, even though obviously not a big fan of the Lions as an organization, more recently at least. But no, Barry Sanders is like literally who I think of when I think of the 90s. And maybe just for full disclosure, I should say that I was born in 92, so experienced a lot, some of my childhood actually watching these players and or seeing early highlights in like the early 2000s. But no, he's literally just like the first player that comes to mind when I think of 90s football. Playing with him in Madden and things like that. I just feel like he's kind of like my childhood equivalent of like Walter Payton. Like I imagine, people who were born or within the 10 years that Walter Payton was in the league roughly, they probably feel similarly. He just has this different sort of like air about him, which is ironic though, because, he was supposedly a very quiet dude and was just kind of very different, right? Like even though he was, such a, just amazing player, but yeah.
Yeah, he definitely was an amazing player. This one, I kept going back and forth on this because there's another running back that like was very well known. Some people argue he's a better running back than this, and I'm not going with him. But I'm going to go with Barry Sanders over Emmitt Smith because I think Barry, like you mentioned, Jeff, when you think of like the talent and the guy who stand the most, like most dominant, like in Tecmo Bowl of Bo Jackson, Barry Sanders is that guy in the 90s. You can't stop him. Like you break the tackles as Barry Sanders. Emmitt Smith had more help than Barry Sanders. That is why I'm not giving it to Emmitt Smith. Even though he's an amazing running back, he had a lot of help from that Dallas offensive line. They had so many Hall of Famers like Larry Allen. Barry Sanders had nobody. He had no offensive line help. His worst performance, I can remember, Jeff, was when the Packers beat the Lions in the playoffs one year in the 90s, and Barry Sanders had -1 yards. -1. That's unheard of from Barry Sanders. And that's because of his offensive line. Now, if he had the Cowboys' offensive line, he would have blown us out more than Emmitt Smith did with us.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
All right, wide receiver here. Jeff, we'll go back and forth. Who is your first wide receiver?
I'll go with the more obvious one, who I think of as the Michael Jordan of the NFL per se, Jerry Rice. I don't really think there's anybody that could argue otherwise, just based on his stats, just the physical specimen he was on the field, just the big moments he rose in, and the fact that he played 20 freaking years in the NFL, like 20 years at the wide receiver position. Just seems, even though it's a more passing oriented league today and wide receivers should in theory have a better chance to surpass some of his records, given the fact that he played 20 years, it just seems very unlikely that, most of his records will be touched anytime soon, which is just incredible. Given that he retired over 20 years ago at this point.
I'm with you too. I got Jerry Rice as well. I think he's the greatest player ever to play the game. Like you mentioned, Michael Jordan. Like people argue Tom Brady's the GOAT and all say that of quarterbacks. But when you're looking at the individual player in the entire NFL history of the game, Jerry Rice stands out to the most with like all the accomplishments and the stats you're mentioning. Some will never get broken of his records of what he did on that field. Won many Super Bowls, almost won another Super Bowl with the Raiders, but that was in the 2000s. But still, he was one of the best receivers I've ever seen. He had to learn the difference too, Jeff, with not having Montana, one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, to transitioning to a left-handed quarterback, Steve Young. That took time for Jerry Rice, and he adjusted because he had trouble at first because Joe Montana was right-handed versus Steve Young going left-handed. That took time to adjust, and Jerry Rice still dominated and is one of the players I think of when the 90s come to my mind. He is that guy like Michael Jordan.
Yeah, exactly. Completely agree.
Who is your second wide receiver, Jeff?
So this one I feel like we might be split on, but I went with Michael Irvin. My reasoning being that, he was a huge factor of 3 Super Bowl wins. I mean, I know that the Cowboys in general at that time were pretty loaded, obviously at the height of their organization being successful, all that. So it wasn't like he carried the team by himself, but he certainly played a very significant role and was one of the best at the position overall, right? And helping them get to those 3 Super Bowl wins. You can go with somebody probably like Chris Carter. I don't know if was he your choice?
Yeah, he was my choice.
So yeah, I mean, Chris Carter was obviously very good, but I just feel like he was more of a personality and just had bigger moments and bigger peak kind of performances and things like that. Whereas Chris Carter, never won a Super Bowl. Obviously, it's not an individual sport, but
I'm going to go Chris Carter, as I was mentioning before. I think the biggest thing that was standing out to me, Jeff, was he was the receiving TDs leader 3 times in the 90s. I mean, Michael Irvin, he had great stats. Don't get me wrong. But Chris Carter, he was a touchdown machine guy. Every time you need to go to the red zone and throw it up there to see what happens, Chris Carter came down with it. And what stands out to me, Jeff, Chris Carter was, if you look back to the early part of his career, he wasn't on the Minnesota Vikings. He was on the Philadelphia Eagles. He had so many off the field issues, and he wanted free agency to happen. And we're going to get to a player later about this who invented the free agency in the NFL. But he was one of those players from the Eagles to go and leave to the Minnesota Vikings. He would not be the guy he was like with Minnesota with the Eagles. No way I see that. But he redefined his career and got lifted with the Minnesota Vikings, unfortunately, because of the Minnesota Vikings as we're Packer fans. But he still did a fantastic job with them. But thank you for not winning a Super Bowl, though, I can say that. All right, I will start off for tight end. He's such a funny guy when you have him on TV. Shannon Sharpe. You always know about his personality, which is hilarious, and why he's on TV, and he's got his podcast and everything about that. But what stands out to me about his game was he make the big plays. And when you need a guy to make a big play, like you think of today with Mahomes and Kelsey and Brady and Gronk back then, he was the guy before those guys all existed and what the tight end position was about. He was the guy who created so many mismatches between the safeties, had CBs, had some linebackers on him, and still just dominate every single time. And not only, as Jeff was mentioning with John Elway, of win the Super Bowls, he was a part of win the Super Bowls too, and also won a Super Bowl in the 2000s with the Ravens, of course. But he was such a mismatched guy, like a chess piece that you just couldn't beat. What I would say before the tight end university happened in the NFL with all the tight ends now, with George Kittle, Travis Kelce, when you think of most athletic guys, Shannon was that wide receiver tight end role. He played that, playing a little bit off, but he did a fantastic job as being like the early pioneer, I would say, of that role, though.
Yeah, no, I also had Shannon Sharpe. I feel like it's a pretty compelling case that you made, obviously. I agree with everything, but yeah, 7 Pro Bowls, 2 Super Bowls, 2 in the 90s, technically, obviously, like you said, he won the one with the Ravens, but great player. It's just, like you said, very funny to see him now and all the shenanigans he seems to get himself involved more recently, at least.
That's some of these players in the 90s, Jeff. That's some of these players as we go through this list. Some of them have their off-field issues, but they were great. They were great on the field is what we can say. And that's what we're looking at, not off the field, guys.
Yeah.
All right, let's kick it off to offensive line. I will start out where both me and Jeff, we wanted to work on this because it was very hard when we were looking at this offensive line because there's so many great players. So we got to look at, I'm going to list some guys that I think that were pretty good. Jeff's going to list some of his guys that really stood out to him the most. So I'm going to start with my left tackle here, but Jeff's going to list out the 2 offensive linemen that he thought that were most dear to him. But my first guy I'm going to mention is Willie Roaf. Willie Roaf, great player. He was very durable, very consistent. And what stands out about his game as the blindside position usually was he was great at the bulldozing. And what I mean by the bulldozing is he was able to push guys out of nowhere when the defensive end, like let's say John Reynolds, Reggie White, Bruce Smith's coming in, push them right out of the way and just keep going when the run game's happening, push them. And he was very fantastic with his elite pass protection. Nobody could get past him. He did an outstanding job with the Saints and the Chiefs. That has to get recognition here as my blindside guy. I'm going to put Willie Roaf here. Jeff, who do you have as your big offensive lineman you'd like to have?
The first one I had was Bruce Matthews. So right guard, played his entire career for the Oilers and then eventually the Tennessee Titans. So, just in general, I think anybody who has more than a 10-year career and ends up playing with the same team their entire career, I feel like that kind of goes a long way to say what type of player they were and what they probably meant to that organization as a whole. Considered one of the best ever at his position, just very durable guy. I mean, at the time that he retired, he had the record for most non-kicker games played at, I believe, 296, which eventually got broken by Favre, but he's still third all time, just total number of games played, which is pretty incredible for a position in which you basically just match against another human being that's ginormous for the entire game. So just really just stood out as a beast and just a really, really durable player at a very tough position.
Interesting fact I'll give real quick about Bruce Matthews was he contributed to 65 100-yard rushing games and 48 300-yard passing games during his career, which is insane when you come to it, guys. Because you look at today, back then, yes, it was a bit more passing, but in his era specifically, there wasn't a lot of like 300-yard passing guys, more rushing games. And he had some great running backs to work around with, but still insane of how he got 48 of those times. Our next player we have was Randall McDaniel, the left guard. We like to go back to left guard. Things that stand out to me right away with him was he was very athletic and he blocked for 6 different 1,000-yard rushers, 5 3,000-yard passers. He was a part of one of the best offenses in the 90s with the Minnesota Vikings. one of the best, and excelled in the sweeps and screen passes. When that had to be played, he was very good at that. So that really stands out to me about Ray McDaniel. Very consistent, and he was just very excellent in his pass protection and being a great bulldozer, like I mentioned with Bruce Matthews. Excellent guy, and was a big contributor why the Vikings offense succeeded very well. Jeff, who's your next guy?
All right, so next, this one might be a tad more obscure, but I went with Steve Wisniewski. In all, sake of transparency, this is probably the position that once I got to one guy I really felt strongly about, I was kind of like, it's tough to really pick a offensive lineman out because there's not a lot of sexy stats per se that stand out or big splash plays, all those sort of things. So yeah, it just seems like he's regarded as one of the top 5 of the decade for sure. So I figured he was safe picking. But little fun fact as to why I actually picked him though. He's one of my best friends from college's cousin. And Steve Wisniewski went by the nickname The Wiz. One of my friend Andrew, we all called him Wiz, all throughout college. Even to this day, we still call him Wiz. So it's just kind of like a nickname that they share in the family. So loose connection to the guy, I guess.
That's awesome. As we're doing this, we can mention that we have a little connection here to this 90s decade team. We can say that. The last player here before we move over to the defensive side, I'm going to go right tackle because we already mentioned more about the center position with Steve. But for right tackle, I put another Cowboy up there. Not Larry Allen, Eric Williams. Eric Williams, who had 4 Pro Bowls, 2 first-team All-Pros, and he was part of that great Dallas offensive line. Now, Larry, of course, I would have put on here, but Larry was more the late 90s session. He didn't stand out to me with the early 90s. That's why we didn't put him on this list specifically. But with Eric Williams, the things that stood out to me with him was those successful first-team All-Pros, those 4 Pro Bowls, and how he was a part of that dominant run game for Emmitt Smith, because we all know Emmitt Smith had help, and that's why we picked Barry Sanders over Emmitt Smith earlier in this podcast. But he also would be very well against the best pass rushers. He took on Bruce Smith so many times. Reggie White, you think of the greatest pass rushers of all time, he took them on in those 90s. He took them on and stopped them very well. So that's the appreciation here for Eric Williams. That's the appreciation out here for him. All right, moving on to the defensive side. We're going to start for our defensive tackle, or some people say the nose tackle. Jeff, who do you have as your defensive tackle?
So I went with Cortez Kennedy.
Okay.
Just because he's an absolute beast. And one of my roommates that I lived with for 9 years after college, he was a heavier set dude in the 300s, and he's a huge Seahawks fan. He's from Seattle. So Cortez was just a player that most NFL fans probably wouldn't recognize off the top of their head, but I just happened to hear about him and be more exposed to him because of my old roommate. So I definitely, grew an appreciation for the player that he was. But also, I had to get at least one Seahawks player on here because their jerseys and their just stadium aesthetic would, for whatever reason, I don't know if this is a common opinion or not, but their jersey combo in the 90s was probably like my favorite, like uniform, I'd say. So
they're great. They were great uniforms, I would say.
So earlier, how I mentioned like Barry Sanders is one of the first players that come to mind. Whenever I think of 90s football, I just visualize the Seahawks playing basically, and just like seeing their jersey combo and like playing with them in some of the earlier Madden games and things like that. But with all that said, this is one of the few times I compliment the Seahawks because I'm still not over 2014.
As Packer fans, we are never over that. But we can be thankful, though, Jeff, that the Patriots defeated in the Super Bowl because of Malcolm Butler, and they didn't run the 1-yard line. That gets made more fun of today than what happens. That saves our butts a little bit, Jeff.
That's very true. That's very true.
Me, I wanted to go with a guy that, when I think of the most feared guys in NFL in history, is John Randall from the Minnesota Vikings. He wasn't part of the Purple Incarnation Eaters. He wasn't part of that defense for the Minnesota Vikings. When I think of him, he has the face paint. He puts the face paint on every single game, and it would just scare you a little. Like, you get the intimidation. And he would intimidate Brett Favre, and Brett Favre was scared of John Randall. And what John Randall did was a dominant force in the run and pass, where it had to be breakup passes, the pass rush, he'd get after the quarterback. He sacked Favre so many times and recorded double-digit sacks in 8 different seasons. Ridiculous to see that. So when I think of the defensive tackle, I got to go with John Randall here. He is one of the most intimidating players I've ever seen come on and just have an aura around him, just like this. Like, you need to stop in the game. You need to make a play. He's your guy on that defensive line. You need to make a stop on 4-for-1, like the tush push. He could stop it back then. So that's why I'm going to give John Randall here my defensive tackle position. Moving on to outside linebacker. Jeff, who do you have as your outside linebacker?
I went Derek Thomas. Yeah, so to me, he's one of those just like iconic, probably considered best at his position, or one of the best pass rushers ever at the very least, I would say. So that there's a few players on this list that I think could probably be considered like best of their position ever, so it's kind of hard not to choose them for the all 90s team if we're talking about that player in general. So yeah, just an iconic player. Like, remember watching him play a lot and just be an absolute beast. And when I started playing Madden, I think Madden 99 was the first one that I played, and I probably actually played in like 2001, and it was before I kind of like picked the Packers because I was only 9 years old at the time. Sorry, so I was still getting into football, but didn't have a team yet, right? So I would play with a bunch of different teams, and I just remember I would pick the Chiefs at times because playing with Derek Thomas, it was just like a cheat code essentially, where he was just such a monster in that game, and it really, really just made me appreciate him.
Yeah, I'm with you too. I have him also as my outside linebacker, as you're mentioning. He was a master creating tackle or creating turnover, and he's on the all-time list on sacks. He doesn't have the most sacks all time, but he's on the top 5 list. So that has to get appreciation. And as you're mentioning, he was a big-time playmaker. So that has to get appreciated. One of the most dominant guys, especially at his position in the 90s. He's one of the players I think of when the 90s come to my mind. Moving on to what we like to say the best position from the 90s, because this had a lot of great pass rushers. And what we like to combine is the defensive end position. And what we really look at from the line compared to outside linebacker, because the difference from what I've seen from the defensive end is they're more up on the line, whereas the outside linebacker is a little bit off in like a 2-point stance, like a little bit like motioning out like a wide receiver, like 2 yards off from the line of scrimmage. But the defensive end is our favorite position we like to say on here. And Jeff, who do you have as your defensive end? I don't think it'll be a shock to me, but I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, he's probably who I consider my favorite Packer of all time at this point now, given how much, Favre as a person has kind of fallen off the wagon a bit. But
yeah,
got to go with Reggie White. Just an absolute, similar to Derek Thomas in the sense of just iconic player, meant so much to the league. I mean, even his connection with the Eagles, right? Like, it's cool to see, living in the Philadelphia area and having a lot of Eagles friends. It's cool to see them have like a fond appreciation for Reggie White in like the first chapter of his career, and then he came to Green Bay and essentially helped them, put all their chips in the middle of the table and like make that big push to finally win a Super Bowl and like change the trajectory of the organization at that point, similar to the impact that Brett Favre had. As we talked about earlier, just kind of the fact that he chose to go to Green Bay, right? Like, people like to make that joke now of what, or Aaron Rodgers does, I should say, of how people are only going there because of him and yada yada, and it's not a very appealing place to go compared to LA or Miami or other places like that. Mm-hmm. So that had to have been more true in the 90s for sure, right? Like, so for him to really kind of take that leap and just like make a strategic decision to want to help a franchise get another Super Bowl, just another aspect that greatly appreciate. Just very unfortunate, obviously, that he passed away so young at the age of 44. Awesome player. Yeah, and like I said, probably my favorite Packer of all time at this point. Like a historic player, I should say. There's some players from, potentially their current team or the last like 10 to 15 years that might be like my all-time favorite, but he's like my old school, per se, or just all-time favorite, I'd say.
I'm with you as well. I believe he's the best pass rusher of all time. Better than LT, better than Bruce Smith in this era, in my opinion, even despite Bruce Smith having the record for most sacks. Like, during his last year with the Packers, he won Defensive Player of the Year. That is insane with his age. So that doesn't, not a lot of people give credit for him for that. And then there's also, as you mentioned before, of like the Eagle, like when he went to the Eagles, he could have not went to the Packers, but he went to the Packers, and thankfully he did well for us. But I will say here that he's the Packer legend and Eagle legend. There's a lot of Eagle fans that will say he's just an Eagles legend, just only Eagles. But I disagree on that. I will say he's Packer and Eagle, just to sake for the argument. But what stands out to me of Reggie is I always think of the humpback move. And the humpback move is when he just lifts the arm up and just boom. It's kind of like a karate move, like you just shove it and like you're pushing over, like you're using your weight. Like, my favorite play of Reggie using that was when he was playing the Minnesota Vikings. Chris Carter's right in front of Reggie White, and the Vikings quarterback, he was like 5 feet behind Chris Carter. And Chris Carter is scared out of his mind. He attempts to block, but like Reggie uses him like a body, and just throws him at the quarterback and then takes the sack down by just throwing Chris Carter at there. So that's my favorite play of Reggie White. He was definitely a dominant force. He was definitely a cultural, he helped out the Packers culture and helped them get back to winning. All right, we're going to move to strong safety. Jeff, who do you have as your strong safety?
The iconic Lambeau Leap inventor himself, Leroy Butler.
Yes.
Well, it's not a Lambeau Leap shirt, but it's a Lambeau Field shirt. Yeah, one of the best players of the decade for sure. Obviously, going to have a little bit of a Packers, preference or leaning. He has a touchdown celebration that has stood as the main tradition for whatever 30 some years now at this point, probably. So yeah, just very impactful to the organization, but also just one of the most successful, if not the most successful, safety of the decade. It's just insane how long it took him to make the Hall of Fame. It still blows my mind that didn't happen until 2002 or 2022.
But yeah, no, that's insane. Like, yeah, it definitely took him so long just to get in the Hall of Fame. But as you mentioned before, Mr. Lambeau Leap, I got to do the Lambeau Leap, folks. We all know that. But what stands out to me about him is the playmaking. Whether it was the Lambeau Leap, and that's still tradition, and that's one of the biggest touchdown dances or celebrations in the NFL to this day still. The playmaking skills. He was a ball hawk, great tackler, consistency. He was very consistent, made the Pro Bowls, made the All-Pros so many times, but he had great ball hawk skills. And I think of him a little bit before, like you think of Ed Reed, Brian Dawkins, Troy Polamalu. Leroy was a little bit both, more of Ed Reed, maybe not the huge physical hit like Ed Reed did, but a little more ball hawk than Ed Reed, I would say. And that's what stands out to me about Leroy Butler is you need to make a play out there at safety, whether making a tackle, need to intercept the ball, force a turnover. He would do that every single time. So I think that has to get appreciation out here for that. So that's why I'm going to put him here, and as Jeff already put him here, I'll put him here as my strong safety. Moving on to free safety. Jeff, who do you have for that?
I went a bit chalk here because there wasn't anybody I felt particularly passionate about, I would say. So I went with Steve Atwater based on accomplishments, 8 Pro Bowls, 2-time Super Bowl champion, huge reason. At times, I feel like Super Bowl champion can get thrown out there pretty loosely. And like in my mind, it's like, of course, it's good. It's a good stat to have that you won a Super Bowl, but it's like, were you out of position or did you have a tremendous impact? Like how much did you play a part in that actual win, right? So similar to Shannon Sharpe, like Steve Atwater was just such an impactful player that he absolutely was like a key piece of what led the team to win 2 Super Bowls, right? So based on accomplishments, what with Atwater.
All right, moving into linebacker before we get back into secondary and before we get to special teams. Middle linebacker, I'll start off first. I think this is a guy that he needs more appreciation. I don't think he gets appreciation as he should get, and that's Junior Seau. Junior was one of the best middle linebackers I've ever seen to this day with how explosive he was. And especially he could play versatile as straight up a middle linebacker, inside linebacker, or outside linebacker. He could play throughout, but he was a tackling machine. He'd go right up and just tackle and make them not even get any yards. He'd do that every single play. He's just very explosive, and he could play well in the coverage, and he could still pass rush. But his explosiveness as a tackling machine guy, that's get put out for me. And he did, I believe, he didn't win the Super Bowl when he was with the Chargers. He didn't win with the Patriots. He might have won one Super Bowl with them in the 2000s. But he was definitely one of the reasons why the Chargers, the San Diego Chargers at the time, what they were called, he was one of the biggest reasons why they got to Super Bowl. Even though they were blown out significantly, it was a Super Bowl record. He is one of the main reasons why they got to the Super Bowl, though. Jeff, what do you have?
I went with Cornelius Bennett, who's probably a little bit more obscure. I have memories of watching him, also 5-time Pro Bowler. But, to be honest, I also just had to make sure I got a Bills player on there because my cousin, who's like my brother basically, has been a Bills fan his whole life. So he's 7 years older than me, so he's born in 85. So unfortunately, he had to endure 4 straight Super Bowl losses, which he still remembers, even though he was only 7. Like he was that into it at the time. And he's, still doesn't trust the team until they actually hit the pinnacle. Like even with the Josh Allen loaded team, teams that are very good now, still just skeptical because of that early trauma in life from 4 straight Super Bowls. Also similar to kind of what I was saying about how with Favre winning 3 straight MVPs and that may never happen again in sports just because people's patience and attention is obviously much shorter and they might get bored with something. Can you imagine if a team made 4 straight championship games and lost today, just in terms of people getting bored with that team, but also the fans of that team, they would be I seriously think by the 3rd or 4th time it happened, they would just on social media be we need to pick a new team. Just how fast people escalate things and freak out on social media now over one game or not even a championship game. So for their team to lose 4 straight championship games in a row, that would just destroy some people now. It's insane to think about.
Moving on to CB here. I'll start my first two, and then Jeff will go his two. First two, I think it's a little obvious. The first one, Deion Sanders, prime time. I mean, there's not much to say. Like, you need a guy to make us play. He just shut down the guy. He would honestly shut down the guy. He won a Super Bowl with the 49ers, even though it wasn't great, the chemistry with him and Jerry Rice. A little bit locker room issues, despite defeating the Chargers like a blowout, like 50-something to 10 or whatever it was. So he was one of like the most standout guys that I think of from the 90s, plus the swagger he carried with him, because he influenced a little bit pop culture with that, Jeff, because you think of like he had MC Hammer when he was with the Falcons, like they made a song with him. They influenced so much more pop culture with that Falcons team, which Brett Favre was a part of. Interesting fact, he was a part before he became a Packer. So I think that has to get a little appreciation. Plus, he was a shutdown guy. And then my next guy was Rod Woodson. Rod was a lockdown corner, strong tackler, and made great pass breakups just to shut down those wide receivers. So those are my two CBs. Jeff, who are your two guys?
Same. You said Rod Woodson, right?
Yes.
I had the same too. Actually, you pretty much covered all the bases on Deion. Yeah, I felt very similarly about the impact not only in football, but yeah, like on just culture, and he's just such a big personality. And then it's just funny because my brother is a huge Cowboys fan, and like Deion's one, still like an idol to him, where he started religiously watching like all the Colorado football games when he became the head coach. And then this past offseason, he convinced himself that they were going to hire Deion as the head coach and then draft Shedeur as QB. So he wanted, and obviously that's
great.
So,
No.
but yeah, Deion is just might be the best cornerback of all time, obviously. And yeah, I agree with Rod Woodson. One other vibe thing to add is that I just always felt he was like a soothing, kind of level-headed personality on like the Sunday Night Football coverage, whereas obviously in sports coverage now, whether it's like the talk shows or just covering a game, there's personalities that are purposely kind of bold and loud and a little obnoxious at times. So I just felt like he was always kind of just even keeled and just gave like good, reasonable analysis and things. So I appreciated him as like a sportscaster as well.
Nice. All right, we'll get to kicker, punter, and return for special teams as we move on to there. My kicker, then we'll kick it over to Jeff. Funny saying for kicker-wise there, folks. I got Morten Andersen, nicknamed the Great Dane, one of the greatest kickers in NFL history. But a great nickname as the Great Dane. Why is he nicknamed the Great Dane? Well, he played an NFL record of 382 games in over 25 seasons. 25. Nobody does that. Even the quarterbacks. Brady didn't last 25 seasons. Nobody lasts that long. Kicker is the only position, I will argue, Jeff, besides quarterback, where they can last the longest out of all the positions, generally. That's one big reason. But what stands out about his game was, again, the longevity, very consistent, and very clutch. He was more clutch than the other Anderson, especially against the Vikings in the NFC Championship game. Did not happen well for Gary Anderson. But more Anderson, more clutch, and thank you, Minnesota, for screwing up once again.
I also had Morten Andersen, and you covered everything that I would want to cover and more. So probably one of the best kickers ever. Speaks for itself.
No, definitely. All right, punter now. I'm going to go with Darren Bennett. And he gets the nickname, which I found out when I was doing research, and this is like a pretty funny nickname to me. Aussie Rules Kick, which means drop punt. So he was one of the first guys to actually drop the ball and kick it. Like you would see back in the day, they maybe have a little bit like distance the spacing, but he would full on like drop it like a mic on the stage, drop it and boom, he kicked it and was very accurate. His average was 43.7 yards per punt and placed it so many times down inside the 20. It was like he has a record for that. I think it was in the NFL history. I forget what it was, but his longest career punt was 67 yards, which is ridiculous. So I got to give the benefit of the doubt here to Darren Bennett. Great punter when you need him to be. Jeff, who do you have?
I also had Darren Bennett. Don't have much else to add to what you said other than the Chargers powder blue jerseys are probably my favorite just like NFL jersey ever. I would always wear it for like turkey bowls with my cousin, his friends and stuff when I was like a teenager. And I just always loved playing with San Diego in Madden as well. So kind of went with a little bit of a vibes pick with that as well, because he was a Charger. They're always going to be the San Diego Chargers to me also.
I'm with you there. Let's get to our last position here, folks. Before we get to our last position, make sure if you're still watching to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you're not done so. Would appreciate it. But Jeff, since you're the guest here, we'll let you finish it out here. Who is your returner?
How could I not pick the only player ever to win Super Bowl MVP as a special teamer? Right? Doesn't that just, regardless of decade, he's just the best special teamer ever in my book? It's got to be Desmond Howard. Desmond Howard for the Packers. Yeah, just electric player. I mean, I know stat-wise, he's not, one of the leaders for the 90s, but just, electric returner and literally won Super Bowl MVP for, again, a very organizationally important Super Bowl to save the Packers as a team potentially. So putting a lot of stock into that also. I will also say the prospect of somebody winning Super Bowl MVP as a special teamer, I don't think that would ever happen again either, right? Mostly because of how the game has changed, right? And like the kicking has changed, but also I think just based on people like just loving like the high, like high scoring games or just like flashy like interceptions and stuff like that. It would be very hard to see a special teamer winning Super Bowl MVP. Like that's just insane, right? That's why he was the only one to ever do it. The only time I could ever see that happening is if it was like there's like a reincarnation of Devin Hester and he had 3 touchdowns in a Super Bowl, and that was the only points that their team scored was those 3 touchdowns, and they won the Super Bowl. Like that's the only way I could see it happening. But I digress. Who you got?
I unfortunately did not go with Desmond Howard, although I will give you a credit there, Jeff, with him winning Super Bowl MVP over the 3 guys we mentioned on this list, though, with Leroy Butler, Reggie White, and Brett Favre.
Exactly.
So I will give you credit there. I'm not going to argue your take on that. I went with the guy who was a bit more, not as clutch as Desmond, we can say, because of Super Bowl's sake, but more consistent and had better numbers, we can say. He was a very speedy guy, vision and elusiveness, and that is Mel Gray. Mel Gray, when you needed a big-time play as a returner, he would do it by not getting the touchdown. He wouldn't get the touchdown, but he would get a lot of like those punt and kickoff returns all the way up to the 50 or sometimes past the 50-yard line. That what stands out to me. But I'm not going to disagree with Jeff. I kind of like his take about that Super Bowl now as I'm thinking of it. So I might change my pick later on if Jeff convinces me more. But like, again, he won a Super Bowl MVP before the 3 guys we have on this list. You can't disagree. You can't argue against that. So
no, yeah. that I think those 2. I think you adding that piece makes it very compelling because it's like what I said was basically he's the only player in NFL history to win special teams MVP or just MVP Super Bowl MVP as a special teamer. But you're saying, also combined with the fact that he was on a team with 3 other all-decade caliber players, is just insane.
Well, folks, we appreciate you tuning in. That's a wrap for this video. Jeff, thank you once again for coming on to represent the 1990s. Thank you. Yeah, that will do it here once again. It's a wrap for this video. And as always, go Pack Go.